Joining us now for World Brief and the review of some of the headlines of today's newspapers from around the world is Adefemi Akinsanya. Good morning, Adefemi.
Good morning, Dr. Reuben. Good morning, Vimbai.
Good morning, Adefemi. Very demure.
Thank you. Very cutesy. I appreciate it. Let me tell you what.
That's a familiar phrase. It became so familiar, so popular, that some people even started calling it Demure.
Oh, is that to the Nigerian pronunciation?
And did you see the John Jazzy one calling it? He said, if you call women demure, you call men manure.
Well, there's that too. Let me tell you about what is happening around the world. Now, there was a huge argument at the UN Security Council after Russia vetoed a resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire in Sudan. Now, the East African country continues to grapple with a deadly war that has displaced millions of people and sparked a humanitarian crisis. The resolution was written by the United Kingdom and Sierra Leone and had called on all warring parties in Sudan to immediately cease hostilities, initiate a dialogue on national ceasefire, and agree to humanitarian pauses in order to ensure the safe passage of civilians and the delivery of adequate humanitarian aid. Russia was the only member of the 15-member council to vote against the measure in a move that British Foreign Secretary David Lammy said was mean, nasty, and cynical. Let's take a listen to what else David Lammy had to say.
Russian veto is a disgrace, and it shows to the world yet again Russia's true colours. Shame on Putin for waging a war of aggression in Ukraine. Shame on Putin for using his mercenaries to spread conflict and violence across the African continent. And shame on Putin for pretending to be a partner of the global south while condemning black Africans to further killing, further rape, further starvation in a brutal war. I asked the Russian representative, in all conscience, sitting there on his phone, how many more Sudanese have to be killed? How many more women have to be raped? How many more children have to go without food before Russia will act? Russia will have to explain itself to the entire United Nations membership now. While Britain doubles aid, Russia blocks aid access. While Britain works with our African partners, Russia vetoes their will.
Now, if I don't send you people was a word, it would definitely be Russia's deputy envoy to the UN, Dmitry Polyansky. He was not moved by Lammy's words at all. He didn't even look at him. But in response to that scathing criticism, he did take to Twitter to say this. Shame on you, the UK, for trying to push through a Security Council resolution that pours gasoline into the Sudan crisis, leaving muddy waters for Western countries that they love so much in former colonies to push their agenda. Shame on you, the UK, also for claiming that the Sudanese government supports the draft, which was clearly debunked at the meeting by the representative of the country. If there's one thing to thank David Lammy for, it is for the excellent illustration of British neocolonialism and snobbery, which his performance today can rightfully be considered. To everyone who listened to his insecure and pompous speech, it becomes obvious why his country is rapidly losing influence and respect in the world. Now, to be clear, Sudan's ambassador to the UN did say that certain demands that they wanted in the draft were not there, including a clause that would condemn the United Arab Emirates' backing of the RSF, something the UAE has consistently denied, and it also wanted the RSF to be classified as terrorists. Now, I'd be interested to hear all of your thoughts on this story. Some could say, though, that this is hypocrisy by the United Kingdom, that if they can call for a ceasefire in Sudan, why can they not do the same in Gaza? But also, how sincere do we think Russia's actions are? Last week, we discussed Russia's growing influence across Africa. Is this another example, clearly, of them going on the charm offensive on the continent for its own gain? Or is this Russia innocently sticking up for another country who does not even have a seat on the table while its own country's matters are being discussed? Now, a reminder that the United Nations Security Council has 15 members, 5 permanent and 10 non-permanent, which are elected for 2-year terms. Now, the 5 permanent countries are the United Kingdom, the United States, China, France, and Russia, while the 10 non-permanent are Algeria, Ecuador, Guyana, Japan, Malta, Mozambique, the Republic of Korea, Sierra Leone, Slovenia, and Switzerland. There has been clearly continuous calls for an African country to have a permanent seat at the table. Nigeria, for example, I imagine would be more than happy to occupy one. Now, staying in Africa, and $160 million, that is the price for freedom, as Resolute Mining, an Australian mining company, has agreed to pay Mali's military government to settle a tax dispute after the company's British boss and 2 other staff were unexpectedly detained 10 days ago on charges of forgery and damaging public property. Resolute, which owns a gold mine in Mali, said that it would pay $80 million, dollars rather, immediately from existing cash reserves and the rest in the coming months. Mali, as we know, is one of Africa's top gold producers and is seeking to extract a greater share of income from foreign businesses operating in the sector in their country. Now, reports suggest that the release of the 3 employees is contingent on the signing of a memorandum of understanding and completing the first payment. However, their release timeline remains uncertain. We're looking at lots of African news today on the Global Brief. Vinbai, please do give us your thoughts. We'll take the papers and then we'll come back to you, gentlemen, for your comments. Go ahead.
All right. Well, very quickly, gosh, you know, when I heard the story, when the news broke, I felt, imagine if they'd had television when the scramble for Africa began, because I'm sure it would have looked something like this. Yes. Africa doesn't have a seat at the table whilst everybody argues about what's best for Africa. So that's really, to use David Lammy's statement, that's the real shame. Now, nobody here is benevolent. Russia, we all know, needs Sudan desperately. Why? Because it is reported that the Wagner Group, which is Russian mercenaries, are extracting gold through General Hemdi's RSF forces. They're extracting that gold and it's helping them finance the war in Ukraine. So they need RSF. SAF, on the other side, the Sudanese armed forces, which is led by Al-Burhan, which is supposed to be the legitimate armed forces, is friendlier with the West and has a particularly beautiful relationship with Anthony Blinken. So you can see what's happening. It's a proxy war. So they're now trying to push a settlement. Rufai is shaking his head. So they're now trying to push a settlement that will favor. Both sides are trying to push settlements that will favor their relative interests. And unfortunately, in all of this, Sudan is war-torn. We here on the African continent are not even giving enough attention to the war in Sudan, the calamity, the atrocities, the starvation, everything happening there. We've kind of moved on and forgotten about it. But if you remember at the time that the story broke, it was a very big story. Same issue in Mali. I know we don't have time to go into it, but same issue. All these proxy fights and wars going on African soil. And I'm glad that Mali, even though they're doing it in a militant way, glad that they're standing up and fighting for their resources.
So let me give you what the real context is. You're correct, yes.
Your perspective.
No, the real context of what is happening.
We don't know because none of us are in Sudan.
No, I'm going to tell you. I mean, you can fact check me. There are empirical facts out there. So what is happening now is that, like you said rightly, the Hameti side was with Wagner before. They were supplying Wagner. Wagner was supplying them weapons for gold. But you know why the Russian envoy is now defending Sudan and our Burnham side? Because, go and check it, empirical facts, they've recently struck a deal that our Burnham wants to give them a base at the port of Sudan. So there's a deal on the table between the Russians and Al Burnham. And that's why you can see in that story, the Russians have now switched from the RSF to the Al Burnham side to say, okay, once we can facilitate that deal. And that's why you see that the Russians were now speaking up for the Al Burnham representative, saying that they've not declared, that the part of the deal didn't declare RSF as a terror organization. So the Russians are playing both sides. They've switched. They are no longer with the RSF. They are now trying to do a deal with Burnham so that they can get a port and a base in the Red Sea port of Sudan. That's what's happening now.
Okay, should I comment or should I keep quiet?
No, never. No one wants you to be quiet.
Okay, if I'm permitted to talk and express myself, I will say as follows. Let me give you now the right context. The conflict in Sudan began April 15, 2023, when General Buhan and General Zagallo, Mohamed Zagallo, fell out. In 2019, the two of them had come together to expel Omar al-Bashir. What you are dealing with at one level is the conflict, the legacy, the fallout of Omar Bashir's tragic rule in Sudan. That's number one. In the course of that conflict over who will control Sudan, the Rapid Service Forces, the RSF, which was incidentally set up by Omar Bashir, is now fighting General Al-Buhan that is in charge of the military forces. So you have the military force and you have the paramilitary forces fighting each other. Now, at the end of the day, 3.1 million people have been displaced.
Yes.
Over 22,000 persons have been killed.
Right.
Sudan is in turmoil. That's one lesson about leadership in Africa. And now Sudan is still suffering posthumously, Bashir that is, from the effect of the bad leadership of Omar al-Bashir. The second point, I think, is good news, that the world has finally noticed Sudan, that there is a humanitarian crisis, the fourth worst humanitarian crisis that the world faces at this moment. Now, all of a sudden, Sudan is being discussed in the United Nations Security Council. I think that in itself is a good development. The fact that the superpowers disagree, well, is another part of the narrative. Well, again, about the composition of the United Nations Security Council, where one of the 5 permanent members can have a veto power. And that has been a major problem to the world. The point was made by the Russian deputy representative that, look, Israel is fighting in Gaza. Humanitarian crisis is there. What has the UK said about it? And now that the UK is guilty of double standards. However, Linda Greenfield, the representative of the US in that permanent Security Council, was supporting, you know, the United Kingdom, which again draws your attention to, you know, this whole issue about the hypocrisy of the international community. Agreed. But as I said, it's good that the Russians have made it very clear that they are not against ceasefire. What they are against is a ceasefire being imposed without consultation with the parties in that conflict. So we should be careful how we run with the Western narrative, you know. But what concerns us at the end of the day is that that United Nations Security Council has to be democratized. Sure. 15 members, 5 members having voted. The situation today is different from what we had in 1945. Agreed. The levels of powers in the world would seem to have changed. Okay, those, I think, are the key editorial points.
Thank you all for your points. Let's move on to newspaper headlines across the globe. And we begin here in Nigeria with This Day newspaper. My colleagues are still discussing Sudan to the left of me. But let me tell you what's happening on the front covers of our newspapers. This Day leads with House members alleging governors are being threatened, or rather, House members are alleging that governors are threatening them over this controversial tax reform bill. And on this week's edition of The Advocate, Onikepo Braithwaite looks at the so-called feeding worms of Lakurawa. She writes about how religion is being manipulated in order to brainwash people, keeping them in a permanent state of regression, which in turn creates a breeding ground for terrorists. Naturally, a host of Nigerian dailies this morning, The Punch, Vanguard, Daily Sun and The Tribune, all feature the response to former President Obasanjo's criticism of President Tinubu's leadership. Now, on the front page of the Daily Trust now, Northern representatives have raised new concerns over these tax reform bills. They say that the region is already plagued by insecurity and low productivity. Meanwhile, the FIRS says it's unfair that Lagos, Rivers and the FCT have 70% of VAT proceeds. The New Telegraph, in addition to featuring President Tinubu at G20 in Brazil, where world leaders have pledged to tackle hunger and support the global south, the paper also reports that the Nigerian Electricity Regulatory Commission has ordered electricity distribution companies to replace obsolete prepaid meters for their customers for free. It said that according to the Nigerian Electricity Supply Industry Act, it is the responsibility of the DISCOs to replace faulty and outdated prepaid meters for their customers. Now, if we take a look at the front page of The Guardian, it addresses the 18 million out-of-school children in Nigeria. That says Hamid Baboyi, who is the Executive Secretary of the Universal Basic Education Commission, has raised the alarm that 34 states and the Federal Capital Territory have not accessed the 2024 UBE matching grants. Now, just Kaduna and Katsina states have been able to access those funds, and those unused funds have surpassed 135 billion naira. The Guardian article also identifies several challenges hindering progress in basic education, including a lack of political will and commitment from some state governments, inadequate budgetary allocations for education at the state and local government levels, corruption, of course, poor implementation of the Child Rights Act, and poor teacher quality. Let's move on to African papers now. And the Daily Nation of Kenya reports on a power shift taking place as President William Ruto is preparing to shake up Parliament and get rid of some 14 MPs who are believed to be sympathetic to the recently ousted Deputy President Rigathi Gachagua. The Financial Times of the United Kingdom reports that Chinese tech companies are planning to poach Silicon Valley's top AI talent. That says UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer has a meeting with China's Xi Jinping with aims of fostering bilateral ties. Finally, the Eye has Russian President Vladimir Putin threatening to strike back if the UK and US weapons are used to attack Russia. Those are newspaper headlines from across the world.
All right. Unfortunately, Sudan got us immersed in our feelings. But also, have you wished the gentlemen a happy International Men's Day?
Gentlemen, happy International Men's Day. How could I forget?
Yes.
How could I forget?
Happy International Men's Day, Dr.
Thank you. Thank you.
Our producers say we always forget the men.
Oh,
in the studio.
November 19th.
You know, usually people forget International Men's Day. Yeah. It's always the women, which was why I had to remind Ojinika yesterday that, you are celebrating Ugogochukwu. How about the father? But she immediately corrected herself and said fathers are also important. Yeah, I think we fathers are also very important.
Yes, absolutely,
yes,
very much
we
so.
fathers are very
extremely important, but I'm sure we'll have time to get into that later.
Are you a daddy's girl? Are you a daddy's girl?
I'm a daddy's girl. Really? I'm a daddy's girl. So fathers are very important. Our male viewers, our male crew, production team, everybody. We're celebrating everybody. Happy International Men's Day. All right. Implication from the
all
men.
the women of our rights.
We'll take a
you guys celebrate.
All the women after the program celebrate us.
We'll celebrate.
We are ready.
We will
in this big stomach.
Dr. Abati, we'll continue to celebrate the men.